Welcome to Avoiding Harm, Responding Therapeutically to Disclosure of a Near-Death Experience. I'm Jan Holden, a professor of counseling at the University of North Texas. I've been researching near-death experiences since the mid-1980s. I'm one of many researchers who have been studying them since the mid-1970s when the field of near-death studies opened with Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. In this presentation, I'll briefly review some points about near-death experiences and then focus on how healthcare professionals can respond helpfully and not harmfully to disclosure of near-death experiences. So by now, you hopefully know that about 1 in 5 people who survives a close brush with death reports a near-death experience, and that the experience itself includes 3 aspects. One is a peaceful floating sensation that is, I call non-material, because the experiencer, if asked, will not be able to say whether their consciousness was in or out of their body. And then a material aspect where the experiencer is perceiving the material world from a location outside of their physical body, perceiving with both normal and extra-normal abilities, like the ability to see and see through walls and the ability to hear people's thoughts, and a transmaterial aspect in which the person perceives entities and environments that are not of the material world, such as meeting deceased loved ones or other spiritual entities, or entering realms that are not physical realms. And that these experiences have been studied throughout the world, so we know that there is a deep structure to the experiences that is universal, involving these aspects that I've just described, but that over that deep structure is an overlay of cultural influence. So Christians, for example, are likely to meet Jesus, but not Buddha. And then over that cultural overlay is the individual expression of the experience. So I like to compare near-death experiences to faces. Around the world, human faces have certain deep structure similarities. There are 2 eyes and a nose and a mouth in particular relationship to each other. So that's a face. Culturally, American faces are likely to look different than, or not American, but Caucasian faces are likely to look different than Asian faces. So faces of people who originate from Europe are likely to look different from faces of people who originate from China. But and then on top of that, individually, even if you look at all the faces of people who originated from Europe, their faces are each unique. So NDEs are the same. There's a deep structure, a cultural overlay, and then an individual expression that makes each near-death experience unique. So in the aftermath of a near-death experience, people experience some known after effects. And I like to categorize these as psychological, spiritual, physical, and social. Psychologically, people's values shift profoundly as a result of what they experienced in their NDEs. Spiritually, people become more interested in spirituality and often experience the unfolding of paranormal abilities such as telepathy and precognition, knowing what other people are experiencing or knowing what's going to happen in the future. And physically, people's metabolism and responses to environmental conditions change. And they sometimes manifest electromagnetic effects whereby electronic things in their vicinity malfunction. And then all of those changes result in social changes that people change their friend relationships and sometimes divorce because the marriage no longer fits their newfound values, and people change careers often in the aftermath of NDEs. So the process of integrating a near-death experience has been hypothesized to take as long as 7 years. Now, what research shows is that the contents of NDEs range in the number and intensity of the features. So one person might just have a few seconds of watching the scene of their car accident from outside their body, and then they're just back in their body. And another person might have a very extensive experience of watching the resuscitation process and then moving outside of, let's say, the hospital where they're undergoing surgery, and seeing the city from above, and then moving on to transmaterial domains and having encounters with deceased loved ones and spiritual entities and all of this. So research indicates that the more and more intense the features of the NDE itself, the more and more intense the after effects, and the greater the after effects, the more likely the person is going to struggle with those after effects, because it's like the rug of their world has been pulled out from under them, and they've been thrust into an alternate reality that felt absolutely real or even hyper real to them, that they remember with clarity even years after it occurred, and it rocks their world. So as a result, people may seek help from mental health professionals in the aftermath of an NDE. But as we'll see, disclosure of near-death experiences occurs to all healthcare providers, and how the healthcare provider responds can have an important impact on the trajectory of the experiencer's integration process, for good or ill. So, for example, in a recent study of 88 near-death experiencers who reported on 188 of their most noteworthy experiences of disclosing their NDEs to health professionals, what we found was that the NDEers reported that their most noteworthy experiences of disclosure were to confidants who were medical, mental, or religious spiritual health professionals. More reported disclosure to medical, and that may be because a lot of people want to talk about the experience as soon as it occurred, and a lot of resuscitations from close brushes with death occur in hospitals, so medical personnel are right there to hear. But people have disclosed to all categories of health professionals. And in those disclosure experiences, the NDEers identified as helpful confidants who recognized and labeled the NDE as an NDE, conveyed that the NDE was, or at least could very well have been, real, did not pathologize the NDE or NDEer, and did not demonize the NDE or NDEer. And I'll be talking about each of these points in a little bit more detail in a little while. And NDEers identified as harmful confidants who did the opposite of these, who didn't, were clueless that what the person had experienced was a known thing and didn't label it as an NDE, or conveyed that the NDE was must have been a dream or a hallucination, even though, as we'll see, research does not support that interpretation. They pathologized the NDE or NDEer, the NDE or NDEer, rendering a DSM-5 diagnosis just on the basis of the person reporting the NDE with no other indications of psychopathology, or they demonized the NDE or NDE or said that these experiences are somehow evil or of the devil, even though, once again, research doesn't support that interpretation. So, disclosure experiences ranged from wonderful to horrible, with professionals from all health profession groups, with no group overall better or worse than another. So even though people reported more disclosure to medical professionals, across the board, people had experiences that just couldn't have been better and experiences that couldn't have been worse. And a really important finding is that 19% of these most noteworthy experiences of disclosure, nearly 1 in 5, were evaluated by the NDE as having been harmful. So that's a lot of disclosure to have been harmful to people. And of course, the ethics of every profession exhort us to do no harm, and harm is being done. And so that's the purpose of this presentation, to help health professionals avoid harm and in fact actually be more than even just neutral, but be helpful to people disclosing near-death experiences. And one of the kind of surprising results was that the quality of disclosure experiences hasn't changed over the past 7 decades, even though over the past 4 decades we've had increasing information, empirically based information about near-death experiences. But people who had their NDEs in the 2010s were just as likely to report harmful experiences as people who had their NDEs in the 1940s. So it has really been surprising that the information has somehow not gotten through to health professionals to help them be more helpful to near-death experiencers who disclose the experience to them. So we did learn that NDEs disclose sooner to medical than other health professionals, and again, that's probably because they are reporting the experience soon after they had it in health profession settings, medical settings. But in all health professional groups, the sooner after the NDE it was disclosed, and the deeper the NDE, the more and more intense the features of the experience itself, the worse the disclosure experience, with no difference based on health profession groups. So again, we think that maybe what's happening with the sooner point is that soon after the experience, the person is very likely to be very overwhelmed by the experience and emotionally overwhelmed, and hasn't cognitively had a chance to put the experience together into some kind of coherent narrative. And so people can sound a little disorganized in their thinking and emotionally overwhelmed, and the health professional might kind of be taken aback by that. But it's important to know that soon after the NDE, people are likely to sound a little disorganized, be a little emotional, be maybe a lot emotionally overwhelmed, and that doesn't, again, mean anything unusual. That's typical, and probably over the course of time, I know that over the course of time, people settle into a more coherent narrative of their experience. They become less emotionally triggered by remembering the experience, so they're able to describe it more coherently, less emotionally, and then engender a more positive response. But that's the whole purpose of this point, is that if you hear of an NDE soon after it occurred, and the person does sound a little disorganized, a little emotionally overwhelmed, that's just normal and not to be backed away from. And again, the deeper the NDE, it's one thing if the person says, I popped out of my body and saw the car roll over 4 times and then it landed and I was back in my body. That's one thing. It's another thing to hear them say, yeah, I was out of my body. I watched the car roll over. I saw people running to the scene. I saw someone pull my body out of the wreckage. And then I went up and I went through this tunnel and I saw my dead grandmother, and we had this wonderful reunion. And then I found myself in this beautiful garden and Jesus was there and we were talking. The more the person discloses, the more the listener is likely to think, whoa, what is this? But again, deep NDEs are a known thing, and there's nothing to think about them. And the best response is just to listen and understand the full scope of the person's experience. So here are some other recommendations for healthcare professionals, and I've organized these as N's, D's, and E's. And as you'll see, the D's, we start with the D's, we start in the middle with things that like don't do these things, and then talk about the N's, the things to enact instead of the D's, and then the E's, which are the effects when you do enact the N's, the effects on the NDE. So we begin with, because research indicates that approximately 1 in 5 people who survive a close brush with death report an NDE. If you are in the proximity of someone actually in the midst of experiencing a close brush with death, then don't disregard the possibility that the person might be having an NDE while you are, for example, searching for someone in a search and rescue mission, or resuscitating someone who is, for example, in cardiac arrest. Instead, narrate to the person in the close brush with death what you're doing on the assumption that they might be having an NDE. So, for example, during a rescue search, you can say or think, if you can hear me or see me, I'm looking for you. And if you can say it, that's fine. If you just want to think it, remember that near-death experiences can hear the thoughts of people in the material domain. So if they are watching you, they can hear what you're thinking. And during CPR, if you can hear or see me, I'm doing what I can to bring you back. And by saying or thinking these kinds of things, the NDEer will feel elucidated as to your actions and intentions in relation to him or her. And some NDEers have reported that they wanted to return to physical life and felt reassured knowing that a team was in the process of resuscitating them, for example. Because research shows that NDEers often, but not always, want to talk about their NDEs, and that if they want to talk, talking can be helpful, and not talking can be harmful. And then after someone who has survived a close brush with death, it has regained consciousness, or even it could be days, weeks, or months after the NDE. Don't discourage the NDEer from talking about the experience. If they have survived a close brush with death, and that is if you are, let's say, a nurse who is there when a person regains consciousness after resuscitation, or if you're a mental health professional who asks on your history form, have you ever survived a close brush with death? Then you can invite the person to talk about the experience on the assumption that they may have had an NDE and may want to talk about it. And if they don't, they'll just say no. But you can say things like, did anything unusual happen? Or an even more innocuous question is, what do you remember from your medical crisis or your medical procedure? And then if they indicate something or even hesitate and look at you like, Can I trust this person to tell them? Then say, if you'd like, please tell me about it. I'm interested to hear whatever you remember from the experience. The NDEer will feel encouraged to discuss the experience as much as he or she wishes. And of course, it's not good to push people, but rather to invite them and encourage them. And if they decline to talk, but you suspect that they may remember something that they're just not ready to tell you about, you can give them your contact information and say, if you remember anything that you want to talk about, here's my name and contact information, and feel free to contact me. Because NDEs are a recognized, well-researched phenomenon, and one factor NDEers indicate made their disclosure experience helpful rather than harmful was that the confidant recognized and identified the NDE as an NDE. Then, don't deny the NDE as an experience that has been recognized and labeled. Do know and name the experience as an NDE. And it's good to be tentative, because people may or may not like having their experience labeled. Some people find it profoundly comforting and others find it limiting, but you can offer, it sounds like you might have had an experience known as a near-death experience. And if they want to know more, then you can proceed with providing some information about it. The NDEer will be educated that his or her experience is a known, named phenomenon. And again, for some people, that knowledge is very comforting and reassuring. Because research shows that most NDEers report their NDEs felt absolutely real or even hyper-real, many cases in which NDEers perceive things during their NDEs that they shouldn't have been able to physically, but that were later confirmed to be correct, have been published. And this phenomenon is called veridical perception. So, for example, a woman is in surgery. She flatlines, her heart stops beating, and the team jumps into resuscitation mode. But it takes them about 3 minutes to get her heart started again. And research shows that after about 20 seconds, all measurable brain activity stops. Anyway, they resuscitate her. They're able to finish the surgery. Of course, she never regains consciousness during any of this. She's deeply anesthetized the whole time. But after she regains consciousness, she tells her physician, I watched while you resuscitated me. And the physician is like, what? Because the physician, to their knowledge, hadn't even disclosed to the patient that they had required resuscitation during the surgery. And the patient says yes, and describes the resuscitation in detail, and then says, plus the fact that I was up above the ceiling, looking through the ceiling, and I could also see into the operating room next door. And there they were amputating a man's leg, and I saw them finish the amputation and put the leg into a big yellow plastic bag. And the physician is hearing this, the surgeon is hearing this and thinking, what? And really, and having no idea what is going on in the other operating rooms of the hospital. But then goes back to the hospital records and finds that earlier that day, indeed, while he was doing the surgery on this patient, they were amputating a man's leg in the operating room next door. And he goes and pokes his head into that operating room, which he'd never been in, and there he sees the yellow amputation bags. So that's a case of veridical perception, and there's now a book that documents 104 cases of veridical perception, veridical perception and other paranormal phenomena related to NDEs. Anyway, because of all of that research, don't disbelieve that the NDE could be a real experience. In fact, naturalize the experience as real, or at least potentially real. And then the NDEer will feel endorsed as someone who had a legitimate and real or potentially real experience. NDEers say that they have their radar out for people who they perceive to be at least open to what the NDEer knows to have been a real experience. And if they perceive that the confidant is skeptical or disbelieving, they sniff that out and they will shut down and not talk about the experience. And then the potential for them to integrate the experience and benefit from it developmentally, psychospiritually, has been aborted. So it's important to have an open mind that at least these experiences are at least potentially real. Because research shows no relationship between NDEs and mental disorder. In other words, among people who survive a close brush with death, approximately 1 in 5 people without a mental disorder report an NDE, and 1 in 5 people with a mental disorder report an NDE. This is an equal opportunity transpersonal experience. Then don't diagnose the NDE with a mental disorder on the basis of the experience alone. Do normalize the NDE as common, again, about 1 in 5 survivors of a close brush with death, and not inherently related to mental illness. The NDE will feel equalized that the experience itself doesn't render him or her crazy. Now, this is not to say that NDEs don't coexist with psychopathology. They do with mental disorders, and in those cases the mental disorder is appropriate to be diagnosed, but not on the basis of the NDE alone. And in addition, sometimes in the aftermath of a near-death experience, people with very intense after effects sometimes find that their feelings and or functioning are impaired. They go into spiritual emergency, and in these cases, sometimes they meet the criteria for mental disorder according to DSM-5. And in those cases, it is appropriate to diagnose the mental disorder. But in most cases, NDEs do not meet criteria for mental disorders, and their diagnosis is more appropriately the V code of religious or spiritual problem and or other V codes like relationship problem or problem related to career that are typical in the aftermath of near-death experiences. And of course, V codes are conditions that deserve mental health treatment but are not actually considered mental health disorders. Because research shows that in the aftermath of an NDE, both NDEers and their families and friends report that NDEers have tended to become more spiritual, including less materialistic, more compassionate toward others, more concerned about others, and more interested in spiritual matters. Don't demonize the NDE as spiritually evil or malevolent. Do pneumonize the NDE as spiritually neutral, benevolent, or potentially benevolent. And the NDEer will feel enlightened that his or her experience was not inherently evil and is potentially spiritually beneficial. One of the helpful reference that I often make is to the biblical verse from Galatians that talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And this is the sort of biblical litmus test of whether something is of the Spirit of God or some higher benevolent source or is not. And that is by judging it by its fruits. And the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And the passage ends as against such there is no law, meaning if these things are present, nothing can tell you that the experience was not of the Spirit. Well, this is what near-death experiencers report. They are more loving, they take more joy and appreciation in life, and they're more at peace. They, for example, lose their fear of death. They're more patient and compassionate with other people, etc. So you can go through the whole list, and that's like a a dictionary definition of what happens in the aftermath of NDEs. So these experiences are not, according to research, in any way inherently evil, but rather they hold the seeds of spiritual development. Because NDEs report they need time to process their NDEs in order to come to an understanding of them, don't determine the meaning of the NDE for the NDEer. Instead, inquire about the meaning that the experience has for the NDEer. What meaning do they attribute to the experience? And ask questions like, what does it mean to you? And the NDEer will feel empowered to reflect on and generate their own evolving meaning of the experience. And the meaning does evolve as they have time to reflect on and integrate it. So this has implications especially for long-term care of near-death experiencers in, for example, in psychotherapy, to revisit the experience and discover its evolving meaning for the experiencer. Because NDEers report that they often find it helpful to read about NDEs and or talk with other NDEers and knowledgeable health professionals, don't deprive the NDEer of resources for further information and support. Instead, navigate them to such resources by just offering them. And then the NDEer will feel equipped to find further information and support as they feel the need to and want to pursue those leads. So here's a summary of the D's, N's, and E's, the don'ts, the enacts, and the effects. And here now are some recommended resources. If you're going to navigate people to them, it probably helps to know what some suggested resources are. So books. I like Ken Ring and Evelyn Valerino's book, Lessons from the Light. It summarizes research on near-death experiences in a light kind of way, but really goes to the heart of NDEs, the kind of emotional meaning and spiritual meaning of the experiences. And it's written for people who have not had NDEs, but I know that NDEers have benefited a lot from reading it themselves because they resonate to what they're reading about, and it's very encouraging and affirming for them. A more heady book is the Holden, Grayson, and James book, The Handbook of Near-Death Experiences. In this book, leading researchers in the field of near-death studies summarize the first 30 years of research on NDEs based on topic like the contents of near-death experiences, the characteristics of near-death experiencers, the after effects, and then some special populations like children's near-death experiences, distressing near-death experiences, etc. So, near-death experiences across cultures and so forth. So this one's a little bit more of an academic book. And then Penny Sartori, she is a nurse in Wales and an NDE researcher, and she has summarized her research and research in general in The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, How Understanding NDEs Can Help Us Live More Fully. And it kind of combines the heart and the head. And then that book I mentioned earlier, Rivas, Dervin, and Schmidt, The Self Does Not Die, Verified Paranormal Phenomena Related to Near-Death Experiences, is a very interesting read for people who really wonder, are NDEs real? Then audio visuals, Roberta Moore's video production, Near-Death Experiences, What Medical Professionals Need to Know, can be helpful. Kate Broom's movie, The Day I Died, The Mind, the Brain, and Near-Death Experiences, is now available online. It's in a slightly abbreviated form. They removed one little excerpt, but otherwise it's in its totality at this website, topdocumentaryfilms.com, and highly recommended. This movie has been researched to show that undergraduates who watched it alone showed a significant increase in their accurate knowledge of near-death experiences and improved their attitudes toward near-death experiences. So it's an empirically verified good source for people to watch. Online, the International Association for Near-Death Studies has all kinds of resources. They have their own archives of people who've documented their NDEs, and maybe most important for NDEers is that there are local groups, over 60 or 70 across most in the US, but around the world. Like there's one in South Africa, there are some in Europe, and one in Japan. And the contact information for those local groups, so someone can actually attend a group and meet with other NDEers and people who have a personal or professional interest in the experiences. The American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences, which is, the acronym is ACISTE, ACISTE, is an organization whose purpose is primarily to certify health professionals in being competent to work with spiritually transformative experiences, which include near-death experiences. So they have a listing of certified health professionals, and again, someone who's looking for long-term counseling might find that there is a certified health professional in their vicinity that they could seek long-term work with. And the online program NDEs, Continuing Education for Health Providers, right now has a part 1, recognizing a pleasurable NDE, and it includes excerpts of NDEers' experiences in their own words, which again can be very affirming to a near-death experiencer to hear that others have had similar experiences. Here are references. These are in addition to the books that I already cited a couple of slides ago. So if you're interested in reading more, you can check into these options. So thank you for your participation in this slideshow. I hope that you found it educational and helpful and encouraging to be there for near-death experiences in a way that is helpful and not harmful.